We are back. Thank you so much for being with us on the committee program. We have a special segment now where we're going to talk to Lizz Winstead, who is a good friend of the show because she is a good friend of mine. We have known each other, I was thinking about this today, I think for about 7 or 8 years, something like this. But honestly, you feel like one of the people who I've known the longest. And we were comrades in arms. And Liz is, of course, a leading voice in the repro movement. And she is the leader of Abortion Access Force. Where can people find exactly what you're doing? Because I want to pivot away from that quickly, but it would be too important not to mention.
Yeah, I think you want to go find us at aafront.org. You can get all of your needs, your reproductive needs met there, and just follow us all over social, AA Front.
And you may not be able to get all of your needs done specifically by them. They are not medical provider. I think it's important to say that just because,
Fair.
who knows, Google, the search engines, you know how this works. It's no joke. So Liz is many things, but I want to talk to her today as the creator, the co-creator of The Daily Show, I think 25 years ago this year.
Yes, July 12th.
Which is, especially for our European friends, kind of the premier political satire program that rose in the Clinton era through the George W. Bush era and continues on today in different forms. But I do think when people think of it, they naturally think of, along with The West Wing, The Daily Show is sort of one of the hallmarks of the George W. Bush era, Jon Stewart, etc. But can you actually walk us backwards to the origin story? Because a man named Bill Clinton is president, and the relationship of the media with power, with the presidency, with the internet is different. So it's different. Why am I talking? Okay, I'm going to be quiet.
Well, the origin story was, it was fascinating because when we launched the show 25 years ago, we didn't live in the cable news landscape that we live in now, right? There was only CNN. And even CNN was sort of this barrage of garbage stories. It was sort of the trial of the century of the week. It was the OJ trial, and then there was the
The
baby
OJ
shaking
era. Yeah.
nanny. And it was like, there wasn't a whole lot of news happening. But what was happening in America was there were these hour-long news magazines dominated, and so did local news, right? So there was when we launched, there was 17 magazine shows doing sort of scare tactic stories that I think a lot of people are familiar with. Stories like your mattress, what you don't know might kill you. Like everything
Exactly.
was just to terrify America. And then the local news was sort of like, if it bleeds, it leads. And so when I was doing stand up, it was really important for me that the media was held as accountable as the people who were making the news, as far as like not telling people the story, not giving them information, really being fake news in a different way than we refer to it then. And so my stand up, and I had done one woman shows sort of talking about it. I did a whole one woman show just about the ruse of the first Gulf War in 1991. And so I had been talking about it for a long time. And so when Comedy Central, there was very few people doing actual political satire, and certainly not media criticism. So when Comedy Central decided they wanted to do a show, they tapped me and Madeline Smithberg, who has been a real veteran in working in late night shows and talk shows. She was the executive producer of Jon Stewart's first talk show. I was a segment producer there.
Mm-hmm.
And when that show got canceled, our bosses went over to Comedy Central and called us. And so they were like, we want to do a show that responds to the world. And that was what they said. And I was like, well, one thing I think is important is
Because
that,
that's a lot of material. The world.
yeah,
It's good. It's a
I
smart
know, right?
idea. I can see
So
how a producer likes this. Yeah.
yeah, so my first brilliant idea was, let's call it The Daily Show because it's on every day. So I immediately was shown to be the genius that, I am. But then I said, we should think about having it be a total satire and having the show look and feel exactly like the news. So if you turned it down, you think you were watching local news. And then when you turned it up, it would drip with satire. And we trust the audience enough to understand that we were mocking just the garbage that the regular news would lead with. And so when we launched, that's what we did. And here's what's unheard of. So in the entertainment world, normally what happens is they give you some money to do a test show. And then based on that test show, they'll let you know if you can do 5 episodes of a series, or 12, or maybe 24 if you're lucky. They said to us, and this is unheard of, we're going to give you a year to practice on the air and work the bugs out. And so we were like shocked. And I've only worked in a couple of TV shows at that point, and they were like, and you should be the head writer. And I was like, okay. So I walked in with some like mediocre white dude confidence, like, I'm just going to say yes and act like I know what I'm doing. But the staff was tiny. We only had 6 writers, and we it was trial and error, a lot of it. It was following the news, and so as the news trends happened, so did we. One of the things that we made sure to do is to hire disgruntled news people, because people who are mad at the media, who actually want to do good media, were furious. I mean, Brian Unger, who was one of the original correspondents on The Daily Show, was doing On the Road with Charles Kuralt until they pulled him off to do, the OJ trial. And he's like, I'm a journalist. What are you doing to me? And so we lured a lot of editors and a lot of news producers to leave. And they would be like, I don't know if I want to. I was like, your business is a shithole. Leave it. Make fun of it. Hold it accountable. This is the best way you can. And we actually convinced people to do it, not really knowing whether or not they were going to have like it was because once you decide you're going to crap on the industry you come from, going back there if you needed to would be hard. The good news is they didn't have to, and they could move on and do other cool things. But so that's kind of like how it all started.
And then when you were thinking about exactly the flavors of media you were trying to satirize, how did that go into decision making about what the structure of the show would be and what you were looking for in a host?
Well, it was a real battle. I'll have to tell you that the network and the creatives battled, because they said they wanted a news show, but really they kind of wanted a wacky entertainment show that sort of lightly made fun of the news. And I was like, no, we're going to do a show that makes fun of the real horrible bad guys. And I said, you want to have celebrities on your show, then why make fun of them? Why not make fun of the horrible bad guys who are making terrible decisions around things that matter? In picking the host of the show, it was the one place that the network had their sights on somebody that they really wanted. And so the show didn't start out with Jon Stewart. The show started out with a guy named Craig Kilborn, who came from local news, and then he was at ESPN, and he was a little bit snarky. He was a little bit like
He was a lot snarky.
yeah, he was a lot snarky.
that was sort of the thing.
Yeah, his whole thing was snarky. And his whole thing was sort of being like, for the olds, Ted Baxter, kind of like, is this guy in on the joke, or is he an empty suit with a good haircut? And we never wanted to reveal to the audience which he was. And so he would read the prompter perfectly, and he would say things that, in that news anchor cadence, but they were just really fucked up. And he would just say things that just kept sounding like that. And I think that's what made it really fun, was keeping the audience guessing. And so when we launched the show, it was more like Colbert's original show on Comedy Central, where every single person was in character. We never broke. The correspondence never broke. And then when John took over, the show evolved, because when Craig left and John took over, you had the gift of somebody who was, in and of themselves, a really strong personality, and could really serve as sort of the voice of the people, while the correspondents acted as the dolty media people. So when they would file their stories, and they would have like this kind of over-the-top Fox News take on something that was completely reasonable, John could play our voice. And so you could laugh back and forth with their idiocy and then John's brilliance. And I think it was a really good evolution of the show.
It's an evolution. In a way, it is also sort of a more familiar thing, because I think probably Saturday Night Live in the mid-'70s, with the kind of, commentary on the picture as it's going by, was probably more familiar to people than inhabiting the kind of the news space.
Yeah.
Although I think the evolution that is interesting is sort of that old style of news, that like Brian Unger absolutely just does so well in making fun of and inhabiting did sort of become diminished in some ways versus, and not even cable news like the Colberts, but maybe even the Newsmaxes and InfoWars, and maybe some of those sort of worse actors are kind of these weird independent ones now. And now you'd make a WKRP in Naziville, would
Yeah.
be the equivalent of the satire show
I
if
mean,
you're trying to tell that same story.
how do you satirize? I mean, I can't tell you how many times we do things now and or I make jokes now and people are like, "Is that real? Are you kidding?" Like I literally made a joke about voter suppression in Georgia where I said I just tweeted part of the new Georgia voter suppression bill is that in order to vote you have to walk through checkpoint Charlie Daniels. And people are like, "Is that real?" And I was like, "No, there's no checkpoint Charlie Daniels. You guys,
Like,
what?"
that's not a thing.
It's
Yeah.
not a thing. But people just are, I guess when you can legitimize that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor in DC,
Yeah, we got beyond that.
anything goes, right? And so it makes it that much harder and that much trickier to to satirize actual information instead of just trying to debunk all the BS that comes out.
But it makes me wonder if the kind of more direct commentary satire becomes less effective because now it's just sort of explaining things, which of course only appeals to one side, etc. And less, I don't know, sort of doing more being in character and just, I think, and this is the thing I want you to comment on, dabbling in fiction, which is something I don't see advocacy organizations doing other than occasionally, things that we work on together. Is it wouldn't it be better to pick a different battlefield rather than spending so much time debunking? And I think there's things that that Abortion Access Front, as well as Lady Parts Justice, who is the foreigners, have done to kind of show not tell that do play into this.
Yeah, and I think that
Yelp reviews, things like this.
I think laying out the garbage and then piling on top of it is how you do it. If you lay out a ridiculous theory, and you can sort of cite that theory, and then taking it to the next level of ridiculousness, or what a logical conclusion would be based on a conspiracy theory, and then realizing, oh, that could never happen because
it's jujitsu. You take the energy coming at you and you try to put it in the other direction because you can't really get in front of it.
Yeah, but it's really just a lot of it is the more that you see people fearing, the more that you can see that like logical people have kind of given up on the truth winning. And they're also terrified that the Americans have become so stupid that if you even make a joke, that somehow the other side will run with it and present it as truth. And then all of a sudden that's another thing we can battle because, it's fascinating to run as you watch, as the Daily Show grew, one of the the media didn't get better, right? And so what happened was when the Daily Show was popular, cable news was like, oh, what people want are funny graphics. And they're like, no, they want funny graphics from the satirical news show. What they want from you is to actually do the news. How about that? Is to put us out of business. I think everyone would enjoy that very much if you would actually do your jobs. And I go on those shows a lot. And the thing that is maddening is when you watch cable news and they decide to have both sides. If they lead with the liar, there's no both sides. They lead with somebody who's just gonna come up with tell their theory. They will filibuster. If the host is not skilled, you have 2 minutes to debunk something instead of then having any time at all to lay out what's true. So it's really a problem. And, using humor, you're right, constantly to just debunk without actually getting at the truth. And I think going back a minute, watching Obamacare was a classic example of how that played out. No one was ever really able to tell the truth of the steps that we were going to take to try to get actual health care and how that played out. And instead it was, all this garbage, death panels and all this stuff. And having just lost a sister this year to ALS and having to do a fundraiser because our our healthcare system doesn't pay for care for somebody who has ALS, that is palliative care. That's what they call the death panels. And then you realize what they're talking about, and it's like, holy garbage. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. And I think even the sort of more classic sin that I do think sort of for someone my age you sort of see happening over and over again is the Gulf War. You know, the kind of just reselling of this thing over and over again. And every time something happens, you're like, this reminds me of that. This is, you said sort of some of that energy is what fueled your ideas to do The Daily Show. What were you working on at the time? And like, what was some of the more active and less satirical satire, let's say, more
At the time we
advocate
launched the
satire
show?
happening at the time? No, before, like, you know, during the actual, like, rah, we're fighting a war. It's been a long time since we fought a war. It felt good,
Yeah.
right? You know,
Yeah.
I remember everybody felt pretty good about it. And
I mean,
saying that you
yeah.
didn't feel good about it, you stuck out.
I mean, totally. And I not only did I stick out, it was an abrupt change for me. I was somebody who had done observational humor. I did a lot, like I did some social issue stuff, like especially around misogyny and patriarchy and sexism. And I didn't really bring a lot of politics to the table. But it was when the Gulf War happened, and it's like I was on a blind date with this douchebag who shows up at the date wearing a Yankees hat and a Yankees jacket, and I was like,
Nice.
look,
Yeah, you were like,
the guy
"That's
is
hot."
wearing 2 pieces of sports memorabilia. They're probably not going to go down on you, so this is going to be a one date thing. We're done, right? So the guy, we go to see La Dolce Vita, and he was annoyed because it was in black and white, and I just wouldn't let this date end. I should have just gone to the bathroom and never returned, but I did not. So after the date, he was like, do you want to go have a drink? And instead of saying no, I was like, okay, because I don't know why. And we went to a bar, and the Gulf War was on the TVs at the sports bar. And it was like, you know, they had a theme song, and they had graphics, and they had hot people
Yeah.
standing on roofs and green lights. And I remember thinking to myself, with no like intention of being smart, of just saying, are they reporting on a war or trying to sell me a war? And 5 minutes later, my douchey date was like, this is so awesome. And I was like,
Right.
what is happening? That is happening all over America. If that's happening to this guy right here in New York City, that is the intended result, right? To sort of game out the war and make it feel like it's virtual and
Right.
take it out of it so
It's
that we can,
manageable. It's away from you.
Yeah.
It's simple. It's a video game, and it'll
Yeah.
be done, and we'll win.
and
Yeah.
people forget that that Gulf War was the first time we had 24-hour news, which meant it was the first time that the war was on 24/7 in our living rooms. You know, people saw televised war during Vietnam, but this was the first time it was happening. And also, it was ratings gold for CNN.
Right. Because
And
they were
so
prepared to do it.
when
Yeah.
the war wound down, they had to figure out a way to keep the emotions of people there. And that's why it immediately, like, people forget, as the war was winding down, all of a sudden Rodney King happened. And then CNN used that not as a teaching tool about race and about bigotry and about all of it, but
No,
as a
it was
way to
just
keep us scared and to keep it going and to keep it going. And then that started just being this sort of permanent emotional space. And so, you know, when we finally launched The Daily Show, America was in a state of that. And then, so when we launched, it was just CNN. 3 weeks later, MSNBC launched. And then in October of that year, Fox launched. And so then all of a sudden we went from kind of satirizing local news and CNN's crazy.
This
I
is
love
when the
this every
hyper
week.
jump comes to, cable news is sort of the big league to make fun of.
Yes. And all of a sudden the desperation to fill 24 hours was so glaring that it made it easier. And, you know, the dirty secret, or maybe not so dirty secret, of The Daily Show is, if you just follow what you're satirizing, you don't have to dig deep for stories. You just report on what they're doing, and then you actually poke holes in their garbage and the way they do it. So it was really actually fun to have people rush to work every morning and be like, oh my God, they've just created this whole thing about like when old people attack. Like, I'll never forget there was some trend on CNN about elderly people who would attack other
I
people.
remember
And
this.
it's like,
Yeah.
what are you talking about? So, yeah, it was just a lot. Or I'll never forget they were doing they used to ask the audience what they wanted to watch. And I'll never forget I'm watching CNN and they were like, you get to pick the story. Is it educating Afghani girls or bride caught in an elevator? And
Elevator. Elevator.
yeah. And you're just like, oh my God, stop. You would be terrible parents, cable news, because your children's teeth would rot out because all you would do is feed them cupcakes with extra frosting.
Totally. Sometimes it's supposed to be a little boring.
Yeah. And maybe a
Um,
little nutritious and healthy.
it occurs to me that it's sort of helpful the order all these things happen, because when it is these sort of silly domestic issues and where the satire can become, why are we putting this sort of, false energy or something else versus like running up against something patriotic that's happening. I mean, do you think being able to look at some of these domestic issues probably was helpful then, as opposed to an immediate, like having to deal with like the second Gulf War?
I think it was helpful. And, it's interesting because, like, you know, it was something that I'd forgotten was, when the Bill Clinton scandal happened, um, I read an article that somebody wrote and I forgot. And they said The Daily Show was the only place that held Bill Clinton accountable and that didn't shit all over Monica Lewinsky, And I remember we did a joke where it was like
And that's true.
Vernon Jordan became the chairman of the board of Revlon. And it was like, oh, that's perfect. A company that makes concealer and cover up, and people were mad. People were mad that we actually were like mad at Hillary for co-signing and mad at mad at all the people that took on this intern. Like, where's the power? Why do we not take down Bill Clinton? And, as we have become into this place that we are now with being a little bit more.
People have forgotten a lot of where exactly they were and some of the things that they've done,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. And it's like, and I feel like people would always kind of try to sell women down the river. It still do, in order to preserve a sort of okay system that sort of worked for them, and women were doing it. And it was like, this system isn't working for you if part of how it works for you is that you're selling out the victims of patriarchy. So stop it.
Right. Well, what was the story actually where you were like doing it, and what ran up against what you were allowed to do? What was the actual line?
What's interesting is you never really
Which I'm
knew
sure
what
people
the
ask a
line
lot.
was.
Yeah.
You never really know what the line is, right? And so once you realize that sometimes the network didn't know too much, then you would just push it. Like this isn't particularly politically edgy, but at one point we had a joke that said George Bush had his head up Jerry Falwell's ass, and they were like, we can't say that. And I was like, okay. And then I go, can we say George Bush's tongue darting him? And they go, yes, because they obviously didn't know what it meant. And it's like a better joke. And it's just like,
Like that works. That works for me.
yeah. So it was like, those were like hilarious victories where you were like, But I mean, one time we almost got yanked off the air in Philadelphia because there was some joke about the Shroud of Turin. They like found it. And then we were like, we made a joke about the shower curtain of Turin, and like the Catholics in Philadelphia went crazy and they were
They
like,
were
that's
like, "That's not
blasphemy
funny."
and you can't do anything about the and we were like, wow, really? Okay. So there was always a line and some advertiser calling and being mad. And then like, the network was always just like never trusting me and super mad because I was always trying to push boundaries. And one of my favorite stories was, they always wanted to shove advertising sponsorship into the show. And sometimes I'd be like, okay. And sometimes I'd be like, no. And so, I think it was it was an Applebee's kind of restaurant. I think it was Applebee's. And Applebee's wanted to sponsor this weather segment we had. And so they call me and they go, Applebee's wants to put money into the weather segment. And I said, I really don't think that's a good idea. And
You're
they
like,
were
I don't know if this is gonna work out. Yeah,
yeah.
let me be
And they
honest
were
with
like,
you.
Liz, we're so sick of you like trying to dictate it. We need to make money in the show and you and your politics and we're going to do it and it's going to be good. And I was like, if you would just let me explain. And they said, you know what? Not this time. It's a lot of money and Applebee's wants to do it. So they didn't let me finish. And the reason that I was objecting to having Applebee's do the weather segment was the weather segment was called Don't Go There. And so they ran the ad, and for 30 seconds, there's a weather segment that says, Applebee's, don't go there on the TV. And so you're like, sometimes you should listen to me because sometimes
Just
my
yeah.
objections may be benefiting you. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I know,
And
but
sad.
like,
and all the things at once.
I know. And it's sort of one of those things where it's like, you kind of can never win. But the one thing that was pretty cool is, you know, when you work for a network, they're going to say no a lot. And the way to survive it is make sure that your staff trusts that you'll fight for every joke. Because when they see you fighting for the jokes to get the stuff on the air, that's really interesting and smart. They know that if you lose battles, at least you fought. Because there's really nothing that's more defeating than your head writer asking you to tame things down or saying, I don't want you to do that because it's too hard. I much rather
it's better.
I much rather have relationships with my team than a network executive who's going to go on and, you know, probably be the president of the animal channel or something. And like, they don't care really, you know? And so I was just like, you know, I'm just going to fight as hard as I can to make the show that I want. And I would have to honestly say when I left there, it was fine, but I think that it was exhausting for them to have to deal with me. But it laid a path for John to stay in the political lane and grow that and make that better. Because had I acquiesced, it would have been a whole bunch of garbage entertainment news that wouldn't have had, we wouldn't be talking about the 25th anniversary of the garbage entertainment satire show. Because there have been many entertainment satire shows that have launched and that have failed.
The rise of the YouTube and all of the etc. has, of course, fractured the landscape, given us the opportunity to do this show, where we do try to put on a show and also be informational. What are you thinking about now, you know, taking lessons learned, etc.? And, you know, obviously you all have your Feminist Buzzkill podcast, which
yeah, and we're launching a whole show. I mean, well, first of all, I should say, before we slide off the Daily Show, I should say
do it.
One thing that's pretty cool that's happening on July 19th is my co-creator, Madeline Smithberg, and I are doing an anniversary show of The Daily Show with the original cast on Rush Chicks. Cool. And that's going to be, we're the only people that can tell the story of how it really all came to be. And so that is something that everybody should definitely watch. July 19th, if you go to rushtix.com, you'll see it'll be up on the ads. And it's going to be, we're going to show old clips. We're going to converse with each of the correspondents. You're going to have a chance for Q&A. It's going to be... Oh my God,
just the video grain alone is worth the price of admission. You know, it's talking about some 90s video. It's beautiful analog stuff.
Oh, let me tell you what. It's so good. And so then now we're going to be taking, we're going to be doing sort of this feminist, hilarious show on YouTube starting in the fall and late October called Feminist Buzzkills Live. And we're going to be breaking down the big stories around, especially reproductive health rights and justice, and just like garbage patriarchy as a whole, and interviewing people you never hear from, providers on the ground. And then we'll have comedy and music. It's going to be sort of like if The View was actually funny and did stories you cared about and would never consider having Meghan McCain sitting on a chair ever. So think of it that way.
We should do the panel. We should have just your gang on all at once so that everyone gets to meet them.
Oh.
And can decide if they want to subscribe, you know?
Well, I think so. And it's cool because the
chemistry.
It's a multi-generational show and multi-ethnic show, right? So it's like me, who's been around the block for 100 years and had 3 abortions. And then you have Moji Alawodel, who is this...
And she's white, folks. I don't want to shock anyone
in the audience. White lady. Hi. And then Moji Alawodel, who is in her early 40s, who is a black woman who is born and raised in Harlem and has really incredible stories. And then a woman named Marie Khan, who is a South Asian woman who comes from Wisconsin, grew up in Janesville, Wisconsin, as the only Pakistani person in
I've been to
Janesville,
Janesville.
Wisconsin.
Oh yeah.
And so she's 32, and so we have this really great cross-ethnic, cross-cultural, cross-age conversation from people who are activists fighting for different things that pour out of their souls and that are all hilarious and smart. And so, yeah, it's going to make for really good YouTubing.
We are excited, and I just want to, just before we go, say when Liz says independent providers, she's actually talking about like the hardworking independent reproductive clinics who actually do the yeoman's work of
They do.
healthcare under
It's kind of,
extraordinary
think of it as
conditions.
like your local.
And when you give your $5 to Planned Parenthood, that's not going there. Like, it's good. They're wonderful clinics Planned Parenthood is running, but this are people who just, there's only a very few organizations highlighting them, and they are the ones who really are in the trenches.
And they do the
just how
lion's
it is.
share of abortion care in the United States.
Yeah,
These
no,
and
that's
and
their,
it's kind of like just supporting your local bookstore or supporting your local record store. These independent clinics are usually family owned.
they don't get
They're
confused about the mission.
and they're often the only people that provide care to the communities that they're in a really profound way. They're really dope. They're the ones who are doing trans care for rural people. They're the ones that are doing, like, a lot of them are doing yeoman's work, going into like rural communities and giving not just abortion care, but also just like some generalized care. They're incredible.
Medical organizing, you could even
Yep,
call it. Yeah, it's
100%.
important. Okay, we're going to talk about all that and more when you come back. Thank you so much, Liz
Thanks for
Winstead,
having
co-creator
me.
of The Daily Show, 25th anniversary. Thank you so much for watching, and we will be right back.
Play Martin.